The rope snapped tight around his neck, but death didn't come. For 20 agonizing minutes, the condemned man danced in the air while hundreds cheered below. This wasn't a failed execution. It was exactly what medieval crowds had paid to see. Welcome to the horrifying world of medieval hanging rituals, where death was never the point. Entertainment was? You think you understand medieval brutality? You think you know what cruelty looks like? What you're about to witness will redefine your understanding of both justice and human nature. Because in medieval Europe, hanging wasn't just about punishment. It was about turning death into the ultimate form of public entertainment. But to understand how an entire civilization became obsessed with watching people die slowly, we must first examine the beautiful lie they told themselves about justice. Medieval society presented hanging as the highest form of Christian justice. It's a merciful alternative to the brutal tortures inflicted on more serious criminals. The church sanctioned it, nobles ordered it, and citizens celebrated it as evidence of their civilization's moral superiority. After all, wasn't a quick death by hanging more humane than drawing and quartering, more civilized than burning it? The stake, the elaborate ceremonies surrounding executions, were painted as religious rituals of redemption. Condemned criminals were given last rites, allowed final confessions, and permitted to address the crowd with speeches of repentance. Priests delivered sermons about divine justice and the mercy of God. The entire spectacle was wrapped in the golden cloth of moral righteousness. Towns competed to host the most spectacular executions. Viewing them as celebrations of law and order, market squares were transformed into amphitheaters. Vendors sold food and drink. Families brought children to witness justice in action. The wealthy paid premium prices for the best viewing spots, while the poor pressed forward for free entertainment. This wasn't seen as barbarism, it was seen as progress. Compared to the blood feuds and private vengeance that had characterized earlier periods, public hanging represented the triumph of law over chaos. The gallows became a symbol of civilization itself, a monument to mankind's evolution from savagery to order. The first hint that something was wrong came from the gallows themselves. Unlike the efficient hanging apparatus of later periods, medieval gallows were deliberately designed to prolong suffering. The rope was positioned to compress the throat gradually, not to snap the neck. The drop, if there was one at all, was carefully calculated to avoid instant death. Executioners were trained professionals who understood human anatomy with disturbing precision. They knew exactly how much pressure to apply, how long a person could survive with restricted airflow, and how to manipulate the dying process for maximum theatrical effect. This wasn't incompetence, it was expertise applied to the art of prolonged death. The crowds began to display behaviors that should have alarmed any civilized observer. They didn't just watch, they participated. They shouted encouragement to the condemned, made wagers on survival times, and competed to secure pieces of the rope or clothing as souvenirs. What had begun as solemn ceremonies of justice were transforming into carnivals of cruelty. Children were not just permitted to attend, they were encouraged. Parents believed that witnessing executions would teach moral lessons and respect for authority. Instead, they were creating generations of people who associated entertainment with human suffering. The psychological conditioning was systematic and deliberate. The most disturbing warning sign was how the definition of hanging-worthy crimes began to expand. What had once been reserved for murder and treason now included theft, adultery, and even minor property disputes. The hunger for spectacle was driving the demand for victims. Some executioners became celebrities in their own right, developing signature techniques and theatrical flourishes. They would pause the execution at critical moments, allowing the crowd to see the victim's terror, then resume the killing with calculated precision. These weren't brutal killers, they were skilled performers who understood crowd psychology. Economic aspects of hanging evolved into a sophisticated industry. Executioners charged fees for special services, quicker deaths for those who could pay, slower deaths for those who couldn't. Vendors sold execution pastries shaped like nooses. Innkeepers offered hanging rooms with premium views of the gallows. The entire economy of medieval towns began to revolve around scheduled deaths. Religious authorities, rather than condemning these excesses, began to elaborate the theological justifications. They developed complex doctrines about how prolonged suffering purified the soul and how witnessing death brought viewers closer to God. The church wasn't just complicit, it was actively encouraging the brutalization of human execution. The most Horrifying innovation was the introduction of failed hangings that were actually deliberate torture sessions. Victims would be cut down while still alive, revived, and hanged again. This wasn't mercy. It was the ultimate refinement of cruelty disguised as judicial process. The moment medieval hanging crossed from punishment into pure sadism came with the introduction of the hanging interview. Executioners would stop the execution mid-process, lower the victim until they could speak, and force them to describe their experience of dying. The crowd would laugh at their terror, mock their pleas, and demand the torture continue. This wasn't happening in dark dungeons hidden from public view. It was happening in town squares with the full approval of civil and religious authorities. Judges would attend these prolonged executions as honored guests. Priests would offer commentary on the spiritual significance of each stage of suffering. The entire power structure of medieval society had become invested in ritualized torture. Victims themselves became props in increasingly elaborate theatrical productions. They were forced to wear costumes that enhanced their humiliation, to recite scripted confessions, and to participate in their own degradation. The line between execution and performance had completely disappeared. What made this transformation so complete was how normal it had become. Citizens who would never personally harm another human being would spend their Sunday afternoons watching people die slowly and consider it wholesome family entertainment. The psychological conditioning was so thorough that alternatives seemed unthinkable. The final barrier fell when executioners began to experiment with keeping victims alive for hours or even days. The hanging became a multi-day festival, the condemned person serving as the centerpiece of extended celebrations. Death had become the ultimate form of medieval entertainment, and there was no longer any pretense that justice was the goal. The pinnacle of medieval hanging brutality was reached with the development of resurrection hangings, executions specifically, designed to bring victims back from the brink of death multiple times. These weren't accidental survivals. They were carefully orchestrated torture sessions that could last for days. The condemned would be hanged until unconscious, then revived with cold water or smelling salts. As soon as they regained consciousness, they would be hanged again. This process would repeat until the victim's body could no longer respond to revival attempts. The crowd would count the resurrections like points in a game, cheering louder with each return to consciousness. Master executioners developed techniques for reading the subtle signs of approaching death, knowing exactly when to stop the hanging, to preserve life for further torture. They became experts in human physiology, understanding how to manipulate breathing, blood flow, and consciousness with terrifying precision. This wasn't primitive brutality, it was sophisticated torture perfected through centuries of practice. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the physical torture, it was the psychological manipulation. Victims were told they could end their suffering by confessing to crimes they hadn't committed, by naming innocent people as accomplices, or by renouncing their faith. The hanging became a tool of coercion as much as punishment. Children born during this period grew up believing that this was normal, that this was what justice looked like. They absorbed the lesson that human suffering was entertaining, that death was a spectator sport, and that the powerful had the right to torture the weak for public amusement. The immediate consequences of these ritualized torture sessions extended far beyond the individual victims. Entire communities became psychologically scarred by their participation in systematic brutality. The normalization of cruelty infected every aspect of medieval society. From family relationships to international diplomacy, children who had been brought to executions as moral education began displaying disturbing behaviors. They would play hanging games with their peers, recreate the torture rituals with dolls and animals, and show unusual fascination with death and suffering. The psychological damage was generational and irreversible. The economic dependence on execution spectacles created a perverse incentive structure. Towns competed to host the most elaborate executions. Judges felt pressure to impose death sentences for minor crimes, and executioners innovated new tortures to maintain public interest. The entire legal system became corrupted by the demand for entertainment. Religious authorities found themselves trapped by their own justifications. Having sanctified the torture as divine justice, they couldn't easily condemn the excesses without undermining their own authority. The church became complicit in systematic brutality, blessing torture as holy work and encouraging the crowds to see cruelty as righteousness. The most devastating consequence was the complete breakdown of empathy within medieval society. People who had been conditioned to view human suffering as entertainment lost the ability to recognize pain as something to be prevented rather than celebrated. the psychological foundation of civilization itself had been eroded. When traveling merchants and diplomats from other regions witnessed these executions, they carried reports back to their homelands that painted medieval European society as fundamentally barbaric and inhuman. The historical sanitization of medieval hanging practices began almost immediately after the Renaissance introduced more civilized methods of execution. Church records were edited to remove references to the most extreme torture rituals. Court documents were altered to make executions seem swifter and more merciful than they actually were. Renaissance historians, embarrassed by their ancestors' barbarity, began to rewrite the narrative. They portrayed medieval hangings as quick, efficient executions rather than prolonged torture sessions. They emphasized the legal procedures while minimizing the theatrical cruelty. The transformation from torture to justice was accomplished through systematic, historical revision. The most successful cover-up came from the church itself. Religious authorities quietly discouraged the preservation of detailed execution records, claiming they were too disturbing for Christian contemplation. Manuscripts describing the torture techniques were deliberately destroyed or hidden in restricted archives. The theological justifications for prolonged suffering were quietly abandoned. Art and literature played crucial roles in the sanitization process. Medieval hanging began to be depicted as solemn, dignified affairs rather than carnival-like torture festivals. The crowds became reverent witnesses to justice rather than bloodthirsty spectators. The victims became noble martyrs rather than tortured. Entertainment. Even the executioners themselves participated in the cover-up. As social attitudes changed, they began to minimize their own role in the brutality, claiming they had always sought to minimize suffering rather than maximize it. The professional torturers reimagined themselves as reluctant servants of justice. The legacy of medieval hanging rituals extends far beyond the immediate historical period. The psychological conditioning that transformed ordinary people into torture spectators established patterns that would resurface throughout European history. The same mentality that cheered prolonged executions would later fuel witch trials, pogroms, and eventually the industrial-scale atrocities of the modern era. The techniques developed by medieval executioners weren't lost. They were refined and passed down through generations of professional torturers. The knowledge of how to prolong suffering while maintaining life became a dark art, preserved in guild traditions and secret manuscripts. When the Spanish Inquisition needed torture experts, they drew on centuries of accumulated expertise. The economic model of monetizing human suffering proved remarkably durable. The same principles that turned medieval executions into profit centers would later be applied to gladiatorial games, public dissections, and even modern forms of violent entertainment. The commodification of death became a permanent feature of Western culture. Most disturbing is how the psychological patterns established during medieval hanging rituals continue to influence modern society. The same crowds that cheered prolonged executions share DNA with people who rubberneck at car accidents, consume violent media for entertainment, and show disproportionate interest in the suffering of others. The normalization of cruelty that began with medieval hanging rituals created a cultural precedent that authorities could exploit whenever they needed public support for brutality. The same psychological mechanisms that made torture seem like justice would later make genocide seem like necessity. The medieval hanging ritual wasn't just about killing criminals. It was about training entire populations to accept brutality as normal and necessary. The most terrifying aspect of medieval hanging rituals isn't the physical torture. It's how easily an entire civilization convinced itself that prolonged suffering was moral, necessary, and even holy. The transformation of execution into entertainment reveals something fundamental about human nature that we prefer not to acknowledge. Every person who cheered at those medieval executions believed they were good people participating in righteous acts. They weren't monsters. They were ordinary humans who had been systematically conditioned to see cruelty as virtue. The same psychological mechanisms that made torture seem like justice still operate in every human society, waiting for the conditions to emerge. Sometimes the most horrifying monsters are the ones we create. When we convince ourselves that cruelty is kindness,